Hi, and welcome to the Girlfriend God. My name is Kelly, and I'll be your host. Today, we have Kendal Parker. She's a classicist and historian undergoing research in her final year for her bachelor's in Arts and Humanities, specializing in classical studies and history. She's an author for Pen and Sword books, writing about ancient history, particularly women's history. Her debut novel, Rebellious Women of the Tudor Period, is coming in 2024, so stay tuned for that. And she's also conducting research on the religions of ancient Rome in preparation for graduate school. She lives in Jane Austen country in England. You can find Kendal on social media on Instagram and TikTok using the hashtag #TheFeministClassicist. She was also one of the latest people that when a complete stranger popped up to ask if they wanted to come on the show and chat about goddesses, she was like, sure. So, anything else you want to add about yourself, Kendal?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so I prepared nothing except questions I'm going to interrupt you and ask you as we go along, and the three questions at the end that we ask all of our guests. So I'm going to turn things over to you. But like I said, I will probably ask questions. That's usually how this goes. You don't have to just sit there and talk for an hour.
That's okay, that's fine. So I wanted to talk about Roman adopted goddesses, particularly Venus and Cybele. Now, Venus obviously is better known as Aphrodite, which was originally a Greek goddess. Cybele was a Phrygian goddess originally, and she was known to the Phrygians.
What does that mean? Oh, that's like a race of people?
Yes.
Okay.
From Phrygia, which is now modern day Turkey. And she was known to them as the mother. And archaeological findings have found that people have been worshipping Cybele since like 7,000 BCE, which some people might know that as BC and AD, but I use BCE and CE.
That essentially means the same thing, right?
Yeah. So historically, Cybele is probably one of the oldest known goddesses in like worldwide. And surprisingly, her cult has continued to this day. Specifically, when Christianity came to the classical world, Cybele was kind of integrated into Christian monasticism, and eventually she morphed into what we now know as the Virgin Mary. So my research is into these two particular goddesses because they are still worshipped today in new pagan religion, but there was two of the most powerful and earliest known goddesses in the classical world.
I'd really like to do an episode on the Virgin Mary and the goddess hidden in the Bible.
Yeah.
So, and I've talked to Carl about that as well. So maybe I'll have a bunch of you come on when we do that.
That sounds fun. Yes. My particular research focus is the material religion of how they were worshipped in the classical world materially, like specific goddesses could only be worshipped with certain incense, for example.
Okay.
Frankincense was well known for being used as an offering for Venus and Aphrodite. But for example, this frankincense could not be used at all for worshipping Hecate.
Oh, okay.
Because of it being connected to the sun and her being a lunar goddess, it's just couldn't happen.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because so my sort of patron goddess is Ellen of the Ways, and which there's some debate about, right? Because like I read this article on Medium, and this guy was just going on and on about how Ellen of the Ways was just this fictitious goddess that Caroline Wise made up when she wrote the book, Finding Ellen. And I'm like, dude, I don't know what your problem is with female spirituality, but I do find it interesting that, so as a kind of neo-pagan, I don't really refer to myself as that anymore. Also as a witch, and I don't really refer to myself as that anymore either. But when I was doing a lot of craft, a lot of witchcraft, um, any goddess that you wanted to work with, it was just a quick Google search or a trusted friend away to say, this is the crystal, the scent, the iconography, the sacrifice, the offerings associated with that goddess.
Yeah.
And there is no such information out there, at least that I have found, about Ellen of the Ways, who is also like a primordial goddess. So I find it strange, and I believe that Ellen of the Ways is also probably like the Virgin Mary, or even Artemis, or a lot of the goddesses that became kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of other goddesses that came before her, or
Yeah.
that were discovered before her. So, so she is very much associated with deer, as is Artemis, of course. But I did find, when I did my research, I did find a lot about deer mothers and deer cults and deer goddess cults and practices and all of that. So, but I still don't know. Like, I've kind of had to make up my own mythology about which stones, which crystals, which, based on that part of the world. So
Yeah.
anyway.
No, that's interesting. That's one of the reasons why material religion called to me so much, because the fact that there was all these rules and regulations, like you do not offer animal sacrifices to Aphrodite, like she doesn't revel in that.
Right.
Or if you was to not offer something to Artemis, for example, she'd bring down fury on you.
Right.
And I found that very fascinating.
I think Artemis only brings fury when you don't respect her.
Yeah,
Right.
yes. But something that also interested me about these two goddesses in particular was how they were so integrated into Roman society, despite the fact that they are obviously both foreign goddesses. People think of Roman religion today as like just copying Greek religion, but the Romans had their own gods and goddesses before
Right.
encountering Greece, and they noticed similarities between their gods and the Greek gods and kind of combined them together. But then goddesses such as Cybele was from somewhere entirely different again, and
I don't
they
think I'm sorry, I'm gonna interrupt you and say I don't think that I know that I've heard of that goddess, but you said she was very well known, so I'm thinking it's just your British pronunciation, and that the Americans pronounce it different. How is it? So is how is it spelled? Is it CEB?
Cybele.
I'll have to look into that and get back to you, because that doesn't
Okay.
sound familiar to me at all.
That was like her original name. The Romans, I believe, referred to it as Magna Mater, which would mean the Great Mother.
Okay.
And obviously, very early Phrygians referred to her as just the mother.
Right.
I'm not actually quite sure when the name Cybele came into use. but she didn't come to Rome until 204 BCE, and this happened because they were at war, and they were losing terribly, and so they contacted the Sibyl, which basically told the oracles of Apollo, and the Sibyl said that they needed to bring Cybele into Rome, and she would help keep them safe, basically. So they went to Phrygia and they got her sacred stone, and they brought it into Rome and built her a temple. And then she became like the central goddess of Rome from that time on.
So let me ask you this. In terms of Greek and Roman culture,
Yes.
a lot of the goddesses that they kind of adapted from religions and spiritual practices that came before them, with these goddesses in particular, what can you say about how they were altered to be less threatening? Like in Roman and Greek statuary, right?
Yes.
Particularly in Roman statuary, or maybe I've just seen more of that than I have Greek statuary. But in that iconography, all of these goddesses, in witchcraft history,
Yes.
right? Witches and the women with the knowledge, they had the power, but they were often old, very old, wise women.
Yeah.
And from them, witchcraft has its own goddess lore, but in Greek and Roman iconography of that, they are now young, fit, virginal. Do you understand what I'm saying? You see where I'm going
Yeah.
with that? So is that true of these goddesses that you're talking about today? I mean, I assume Venus, okay, she obviously was very beautiful, probably in any iteration. She
Yes.
probably wasn't always naked,
No,
right?
this is true. She didn't become naked until the very early Christians began like scheming their way into Rome.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like everything that Venus stood for became shameful. And so they
Right.
expressed that by stripping her and making her something that they should avert their eyes from.
Right. Because it's built into that culture, and then later, even more so in the Christian culture, that beautiful, powerful, independent women are to be feared.
Yes. But to the ancient Greeks, Aphrodite was to be feared. She wasn't just about love and sexuality and beauty. She
Right.
was somebody that could command a desire for war as well as love.
Right.
And they believed that it was her that helped them win the battles and did, like built up the fury for them to fight.
Right.
She was fierce. As for Cybele, she was the goddess. So she was the mother. She would look after you and protect you and keep you safe. But if you got on the wrong side of her, you were going to know about it. She was not somebody to mess with.
Right.
And that stuck with her all throughout the areas that she was worshipped in. She was always somebody that you feared as well as revered.
Right. Okay, I'm not going to interrupt you to ask any more questions. Go on.
That's okay.
But that's kind of how it is, right? Otherwise, it's just me sitting here listening to you talk.
Yes, of course.
So, okay.
And
try and keep, and I'll edit this out, and try and keep in mind that a lot of the people, of the big like 30 something people that listen to this podcast, most of them are not academics.
Yes, okay. So to break it down then, so Venus was the goddess of love, desire, beauty, things like that. But she was also the goddess of prostitutes and conflict and gardens and fertility of the earth. Like all these things came from her. Whereas Cybele was also a goddess of fertility, but unlike, cultured gardens and things like Venus would preside over, Cybele was all wild nature and animals and like raw outdoor nature. But the fact that they were both very similar in what they covered, and how they've both come from such early origins all the way through to the present day, but particularly how they both link to Virgin Mary. Like if you trace the histories of both goddesses, they end up in the cult of the Virgin Mary.
Tell me about that. Tell me more about that.
So obviously Cybele herself is a direct descendant of the Virgin Mary. She can be followed all the way from Phrygia in like 7000 BCE right through to the founding of the Gnostic cult in Christianity. She was by the early Christians, she was so feared by the people that had been raised to believe that she was the goddess, and then this new religion came in and that was taken over. So they wanted to pay attention to this, but at the same time they feared if they completely turned their back on Cybele, she would retaliate. And so to get around this, they slowly spoon-fed her cult into the cult of the Virgin Mary. Some research I've done, though I've not been able to corroborate it, so I'm not sure how true this is, but some research I've done has given the impression that the Virgin Mary herself wasn't an idea in early Christianity until the idea of wiping out Cybele was considered something that they needed to not do.
Right. That's really interesting. I don't know a lot about the evolution of the Virgin Mary as an idea. I've read a lot about the Shekinah.
Yes.
And Sophia, who isn't actually a goddess. She's sort of a goddess, but sort of not a goddess.
Like Helen.
Yeah.
Of Troy, of course, Helen of Troy.
I know that, since I was born and raised here in America, I was raised on the East Coast, and on the East Coast, it's all Catholicism all the time.
Yeah.
Just because of the way that, that emigration happened. And so we have a lot of Italians and Greeks and Poles and Slavs and Czechoslovakians and Hungarians, and who also have their whole host of goddesses and their own mythology. But I haven't found anybody that's a specialist in that yet. But anyway, knowing that, growing up in a church, and and I'm grateful that my parents weren't particularly strict Catholics.
Yes.
I mean, we did go to church every Sunday, but I think that, I don't know what they got out of it, but it was very much part of their social life as well. So
yes, of course.
But I remember even from a very young age having Mother Mary be the character that I identified with the most.
Yeah.
Or that I at least could have some sort of child, adolescent like understanding of, because she was loving. You know what I mean? She was loving and she was nurturing, and I was drawn to that.
Yeah.
So it was a buffer from the you're a bad person if you do A, B, C, and D. I'm sure that that in this country, this is, and I'm sure in other countries, and in parts of yours, that is a very that that's a common thread, and it's a real issue.
Yeah.
And they're just starting to understand now how that has affected people on a behavioral level, on a self-esteem level, for sure, right? Because you're always going to hell
Of
and you're
course.
always a bad person. So you're always a bad person trying to be a good person, and you're always a person damned for hell trying to get into heaven.
Yes.
Like that's the whole thing. That's the whole Christian vibe that has been in the United States since it was founded.
Yes. No, I do understand that. My family themselves are atheist, but
That's
maternal
better, I
my
think.
maternal grandmother was a Catholic, like
Okay.
school with nuns and everything. And she, despite being a Catholic herself, she always told me Catholics are evil and nuns are evil. Like it's not you, it's them.
Right, right. I don't know that I don't think I believe that, but that's funny that she said that. And when I said, with atheists, which I don't really understand, but what I admire about atheists is that most of us want to be or try to be kind, loving, compassionate people
Yes.
because we want to be quote unquote good people. But atheists are that way. And I, for example, want to be that way because it's in alignment with my spiritual beliefs and the
Yes.
spiritual principles that I have developed for myself. Atheists do it just because it's likely the right thing to do. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? They're
Yeah.
not worried about appeasing anybody or pleasing anybody or doing, or being good. They just think, you know what, I can hold the door for that guy, you know?
Yeah.
So,
I know.
so back to the Virgin Mary, like, I don't know, say more about that because I'm really fascinated about that.
Okay. Let me just
Sorry, you probably had a ton of material prepared and I'm just
No,
fucking
it's
it all up
okay.
for
I
you.
can take notes for that. I just have to wheel her out. No, 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 no. I tell you something that I did want to talk about particularly was Cabela's cult itself. Once it was brought into Rome, I'm not sure if this was the case before then because that was like pre-Bronze Age. But after she was brought into Rome, they had festivals for her and obviously cults and temples. And what I found really fascinating about her was the priests were known as the Galli, and they could only be foreigners. It was made rule in Rome because of what had to happen to become a priest of Cabelae was so beyond Rome's understanding that they just outlawed it. You was not allowed to be a Roman citizen and be a priest of Cabelae. And this was due to the fact that the men that became priests for Cabelae would do the hair up all fancy and put on really elaborate, fantastic makeup and wear women's clothes and was essentially drag queens.
Right. That's
And
awesome.
when you was initiated to become a priest of Cabelae, you was to get high basically and perform self-castration.
Wow.
And the fact that basically the priests of Cabelae was the world's first drag queens,
Right,
like
right,
amazed me.
right.
100 years.
Drag queen eunuchs in service to a divine feminine goddess.
Yes,
We got to be able to
fascinating.
make like a rock band or a book out of that, right? Or a
Yeah,
TV series. That sounds like a great TV series.
yes, like I was my jaw literally fell open when I found this out, because I was like, today, even today, like we're at the 21st century, like, and even today, something like that would be looked down on by most people. And like,
Not me, man. I'd be jealous.
yeah, this is like Augustan Rome, and you've got these drag queen priests that's like got say so on what's going on because their goddess is the goddess.
That's fabulous.
It is fabulous. That's what I thought too. And the fact that Cavele was that powerful,
That they
and
would
that,
do that. I mean,
yeah,
how can you do that and not die?
yes, like obviously medicine in that time would have been terrible. Like I don't know how they did this without dying of blood loss. But
Well,
the fact,
sometimes I think ancient cultures are smarter than we sometimes give them credit for. I'm sure they developed a method to do it so that people would continue, because the first 8 were probably like, and then the last guy was like, you know what, we should probably figure out a way to stop the bleeding.
yeah. Yes, but I just
And
thought
think
like
about, I'm sorry, I'm so jazzed about this. Like,
it's
can you
okay.
imagine people like wanting to do that and then they find out about that part and they're like, yeah, okay, no, I changed my mind. I'm gonna go join this cult over here or
Yeah.
this cult over here. Not your cult. Thank you. Thank you for seeing me and answering my questions.
Yes. Yes, like it
You
opened up
should
so
write
many
you should
questions.
write your next book about that.
Oh yes, yes. If I can find enough primary source material, that is
Or
definitely
you could
something that
just
I should
make it
consider.
or you could just make it historical fiction. Just
Yes,
saying.
this is true too. This is true.
You can do
Um,
anything as a
yeah,
writer. I mean, you really can.
but I don't know. It just blew me away, the fact that they did this. But then my thought then immediately went to like, how powerful must this goddess be that they would actually do that? They would go through with it. And not just these priests that came with her, but like even Roman citizens would like sneakily worm their way in, even though they
Right.
were forbidden. And 100 years after she'd been there, because she'd become that all-encompassing and central to Roman religion, Claudius lifted the ban, and even Romans were allowed to join her priesthood. Um,
Wow.
and this is because they wanted to, knowing that that's what would happen.
Wow.
So obviously there was something there. She was some power for them to go to such extremes.
So for the Romans to yield to that and allow other Romans to join that cult, they must have seen, or they must have had some experience that gave them such overwhelming evidence
Yes,
that they couldn't deny it. You know what I mean?
yes, definitely.
And I would love to know what that was.
I
Wouldn't
know.
you?
Yes, yes. Like
You
as soon
know,
as I
our
found out about this, I was like, that is it. This is where my research is going. I need to know more.
yeah. I don't know, man. Like I myself often wish that my goddess would, appear as a hologram. Um, but it had to be something like that. It had to be something that was beyond faith, because faith is believing what you can't see,
Yes.
right? Or, can't see or smell or taste or touch or any of those things.
Yeah.
So it had to be, I wonder what it was. Keep digging
I am
and
going to
get
have
and
to
get
start
back to me
digging.
on that.
Yes, it was obviously the Romans were such a masculine race.
Right.
Um, and for them to say, like, okay, we're lifting this ban, we're going to accept this, you can do it. And for these masculine men to want to do that, she
Yeah.
must have had some sway somewhere for them
Wow.
to submit to such. Well, they were essentially emasculating themselves
Right.
in a culture where masculinity was everything.
So what else did they have to do?
Um, well, obviously they had to tend the temple and it was their job to host her festivals throughout Rome.
Which entailed what?
Well, offerings, obviously, incense, food. Sometimes they would bake cakes. But Cabele was Cabele, so obviously there was sacrificing of bulls.
Okay.
And this would be wild.
Of course.
Wild bulls, because obviously bulls are a very masculine animal. And they would be decorated up with ribbons on the horns and things, and they would be brought to her temple. And the priests would slit its throat basically, and there'd just be blood everywhere, and that would be her offering. She would want these masculine, very male bulls offered to her basically in blood sacrifice.
Wow.
I guess as a reminder that, okay, yes, I'm the mother and I'll keep you safe, but don't mess with me.
Yeah.
In the early 6th century Athens, Cabele also had a sanctuary there known as the Matroon. This was a religious and political site, as it was custom there to erect stelae of written laws, and it was also believed that trial records and court proceedings were stored inside the sanctuary as a kind of archive. The Matroon was a public space at the heart of the community, and Cabele presided over it as the guardian of written justice. She wasn't worshipped for the Greeks like she was in Rome or Phrygia. The Athenian sanctuary served as a religious sanctuary and an archive up until the 2nd century CE. But like I said, in Greece, Cabele was merely a political creature, a political cult surrounding her. Her Phrygian mysteries bypassed Greece entirely and were not used in Greek religion at all. It wasn't until the Romans adopted her and them in earnest with the Gallic priests and the court of Cabele in Rome. It's a small shrine, so material evidence would say that it was stone. Okay. And I would presume that they would make the offerings onto the stone, maybe incense burning for her or burning of cakes. Maybe in some places they would make animal sacrifices. Or the most of these offerings obviously would be done at the temple. And during the festival, which I don't actually remember what it's called for Cabele. I do believe she only had one. And yes, there was only one for her in Rome, where obviously Venus had like thousands. She was worshipped on the 4th of every month and the 26th of September and various things.
I know you want to talk about Venus, but I'm so fascinated with this other goddess that I never heard about before today.
No, she's fascinating. A personal anecdote I had about this was when I started researching her, shortly after I went to a museum with my dad. Mm-hmm. And it's in the basement of an antique store. So when we came out, my dad was like, okay, let's look in the antique store. So we're just minding our own business, looking at all these things from his childhood and him telling me like, oh, I remember having one of these. Oh, I had one of those. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw this tiny little figure of the Virgin Mary. Don't know why she caught my eye. I've never had any interest in her before. And it wasn't until afterwards that I found out Cabele had any connection to her. But I saw her sat there and she caught my eye and I picked her up and I was examining her and I put her back. And I could not leave that shop without her. Something just told me, you need to have it. Yeah. And so I bought her. And I brought her home and sat her on my desk and just carried on studying. Then I found out a day later that Cabele was essentially the ancestor of the Virgin Mary. And I thought that was really strange that I'd had this connection to this little figure of her having no prior interest in her whatsoever, and then to find out she's essentially Cabele.
Would you be jealous if I told you that kind of shit happens to me all the time?
No, of course not. But it's the first time. It's the first time it's happened to me. And I thought it was really strange. Like the fates was telling me, like, this is what you should be doing. Or maybe even Cabele herself telling me, this is what you should be doing. Tell my story.
So, since you mentioned that, I think that's a good segue into, and again, I apologize. We could do a whole other podcast about Venus at some later date, but I want to shift gears a little bit. And so, obviously, one of the things we talk about a lot on this podcast is spirituality. So, tell me, and because our podcast or my podcast is about what it is, I want frothy emotional details, not just academic textbook research based answers. Okay. um and Carla was as terrified as you look right now.
Okay.
Poor Carla. I keep calling her out all the time because she's like the first person that did this for me. So she's like my reference point, you know?
Okay, right. Okay.
So having experiences like that, I'm sure you know that falls in the non-logical
Yes, yeah.
side of things and the realm. So tell me as much as you're comfortable telling me about your spiritual life and how that informs the work that you do or the work that you chose to do, because I'm sure it has a lot to do with the books that you're going to write also,
Yeah,
or are
yes.
those more academic?
Currently, it's more like a love child. Obviously, I live on the Nottinghamshire Derbyshire border in England.
I'm just going to nod like I know what that means.
Yes, well, basically, it's a hotbed for history.
Okay.
And there are an abundance of historical sites around my home, and they were all owned by the same family. And their mother was Bess of Hardwick, and she created all these houses. She designed them and had them built and give them to her children, and they're all still standing. And obviously, I've grown up with this history and found Bess herself fascinating because in a time when people died in the 40s, she lived to be 72.
Wow.
And in a time where if you wasn't a man, you had no power, she built and maintained a dynasty. She was fascinating. And so my first book is going to be about her and the women of her time because I need more people to know about her, basically.
Right.
Yes. But that, like, once that's done, obviously I'm going to have to write about things that I actually know about.
Right. Yeah, I get that.
But I like, it's been embedded in me from childhood that people need to know about Bess. Like, she deserves to be known.
Right.
Outside of this locality.
Right. I find it interesting that so much of our, with the exception of the Native Americans, so much of our spiritual culture, whether popular or not, comes from elsewhere. The whole neo-paganism movement in the United States, none of those are based on American gods and goddesses. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We had to import everything that we've craved under the rule, under the thumb of Christianity and Catholicism. I mean, I say that like we don't have Muslims or Jews in America, because of course we do. But I can only tell you about my own lived experience, which is being under the thumb of the Christian and Catholic rule. Other mainstream religions don't really pay much attention to me unless I say I'm a witch out loud. Then it's usually an issue. But so I've always wondered how like that had to happen in other ways, right? Before the dawn of information and education and information exchange between us and other countries. My theory is, and what I should probably do research and write a book about, but I don't want to because it doesn't sound like fun. Um, but maybe it would be. With how many people from how many different places in the world did immigrate to the United States, surely they brought their gods and goddesses with them,
Yeah,
particularly witchcraft
yeah,
practice. I mean, like we know today, we know a lot about, and I may mess up the pronunciation of this, but about strega, which is, essentially means white witch and witchcraft. So I wonder how many other kind of little pockets here and there of a goddess or god that mainstream neo-paganism might not have heard of is still practiced today in that way and in secret because they're very well aware of the country that they're living in now.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah. I know what you mean.
Especially, like I said, especially in witchcraft, and maybe there's probably more than that, but again, that's my own experience. Like some just some of the rituals that we have, particularly ones that draw on, that use like Latin phrases in their spell casting. And, I mean, some of
Yeah,
that shit's really old. Um, but as Americans, it's hard for us to know or kind of wade through where that came from. And particularly now, in the age that we're in now with neo-paganism and the internet, and particularly social media. I mean, technology is always a blessing and a curse, right? That there's
yes,
so much misinformation out there. Nobody knows what's going on or what information is rare. I mean, other than the academics, right? Or the people
yeah,
like
yeah,
myself that know how to research in an academic style or have academic friends that they go to and say, hey, could you look into this thing for me? To my like PhD candidate friends who are like, yeah, I have time for that. Sure. um, and some of it, I think, because we are all descendants of other countries, and most of us are just, like a mixed breed of so many other um, ethnicities. Some of it, I believe, and I have no evidence to back this up, but I believe that some of it is just intuitive because we have that in our line of ancestry.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like beyond the shadow of doubt, I am sure there is a witch or more than one in my ancestral line. Like maybe it wasn't my grandmother or great grandmother, but it could be 6 generations ago, 7 generations ago, 8, 9, 10, when those ancestors were still in another country. You know
yeah,
what I mean? I think that gets passed down. I mean, hell, they've shown that memory and trauma get passed down genetically. So why wouldn't esoteric knowledge also be passed down generationally? You know what I mean?
yeah. I know what you mean.
So,
Um, yeah.
so you got me all excited about something else to talk about. So back to your spirituality.
um, well, it's hard to pin down my spirituality, to be honest. Um, when I was in college, I dabbled in witchcraft. I thought
Hasn't everybody dabbled in witchcraft at
yeah,
this point?
yeah, everybody's had a go. um, nothing like it didn't stick. But then saying that, into going into adulthood, I found myself using crystals for the metaphysical properties. I mean, my room's like a geologist lab.
or a witch's room, because
Yeah, yeah,
ours all look like that.
yes. And it's not ever. It's always just been there. Like oh, I'm struggling. Like, I don't know where to go with this idea. I don't know what I'm thinking about. Oh, I know, I'll pull a tarot card. Don't even think about it. Don't consider it witchcraft. Don't consider it spirituality. It's just what I do. Didn't really pay any attention to it for years until I brought my other half home for the first time. And he came in my room and looked around and he said, if I didn't know any better, I'd say a witch lived here.
So that was like your aha moment, right?
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, it's a good job you don't know any better.
Oh, that's fabulous. Well, I mean, the word spirituality itself is that's a very broad term and it covers a lot of different things. And
Yeah.
I think that anything that feels intuitive, like your experience with the little Mary statue,
Yes.
can be spiritual.
Yes, of course. I mean, there's some things that I put my hand up and say, like, I can't believe in that because my academic knowledge tells me that that can't be right.
And
But at
and
the
every
same,
every academic I've run into who looks at stuff like this has that same struggle.
yes, but at the same time, also doing what I do, I found goddesses like Venus and Cybele that go back so far in time that there's got to be some truth there.
Right.
So, in that sense, I'm open. I do believe there's something there. And I'd like to think of it as, the mother, the god, like the goddess, some kind of divine feminine. I couldn't say like I actively believed in Cybele or Venus, but at the same time, like you can't explain away like the experience I had with the little figure.
Right.
Like something was telling me something.
Right.
So I've always tried in that sense to remain open. If something happens that I can't explain academically or scientifically,
right.
I am not going to say, oh, well, it's just a fluke, it's just a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence. Everything happens for a reason.
Right. Right. And people don't often understand what that phrase means that you just said, everything happens for a reason. Like, especially people that want to argue that point, right? Like they'll be like, so my 17-year-old son was killed in a car accident. You're going to tell me that happened for a reason? I'm going to say, yes, I am going to tell you that happened for a reason. I'm not going to tell you it happens for a reason that happened for a reason that you can understand with our limited human understanding of things. But if you believe in anything, you must believe that the universe is bigger than you and the son that you lost, which means that yes, it may be tragic, and yes, in our very human experience, that it is a tragedy and it's horrible, and you will grieve forever. But we don't know what happened after he left.
This is true.
Right? There may be, especially since, so I'm also a past life regression hypnotist.
Okay.
And having a very strong belief system in that, in the things that I've been taught, because I went through two different like I'm certified in two different modalities, and from everything that I saw and experienced, it is my belief that when we die, or maybe not everyone, when I die, I will be given the choice. I have a choice to either return as a human or something else, right? I think any kind of living thing, right? An animal, a tree, a plant, the grass, whatever. which you'd think would be painful because people always walk on the grass. God, I am getting so old because that was like corny, it was like dad joke corny, what I just said there. But um I distracted myself. So I've come to believe, based on what I've been taught, that we have this choice, and some of our other choices are to go be with our creator, whatever our version of that was in our head when we were alive, or to become a spirit guide for someone in particular, or to become a guide for people, involved in a particular activity or occupation or cause, or you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's not like we die and we just get one choice, come back or don't. I think there's more choices than that. Like, again, not everybody believes that, but that is certainly what I believe, because if the universe itself is so vast and so big, really, you think that whoever's in charge only gives us two choices? Come on.
Yeah.
That just doesn't track for me, Um, and I've also seen enough evidence of, there's this really old documentary, and you can watch the whole thing on YouTube now, and it's very old and it's very dated, and about halfway through it takes a turn into Christianity,
Okay.
but it's still worth watching because it's called A Case for the Creator,
Okay.
or no, A Case for a Creator, or maybe it's the creator, a creator, I don't know, I'm sure you could find it.
Yeah.
And in it gives all of the scientific evidence of it. Like, it has to be, there has to be an intelligent entity in charge of it all, because, like, I'm trying to think of some of the really great examples that they gave. Like, they looked at cells on a molecular level, and talked about the the infinitesimally small kind of mechanics of how cells work.
Okay.
That doesn't make any sense, right? And they talked about how in astronomy, where we are in the solar system is an exact position that allowed several things to happen. One, for us to have our moon. Two, for us to have our sun. But more importantly, they broke down the math, and I'm not a math person, so I can't repeat it, but they essentially did this mathematical equation where they showed, if our planet was like, 1 millionth of an inch to the left or right of where we are, we would not be able to observe the galaxies the way we can.
Okay.
So we were put here so that we could do that, right? And men of science, I was going to say in ancient times, I don't know that to be true, but certainly in more modern times, men like Isaac Newton and Nicholas Tesla were informed by spiritual theology. For them, I mean, I think we're coming back around to that again now, where there's a lot of talk about the link between science and spirituality. But they already had that. There's a bunch of, if you've read anything by Einstein, like, he's got a bunch of quotes about God and the universe. And, I mean, for them, it wasn't that unusual to have those beliefs and still be a scientist.
No, of course not.
So anyway, so yeah, I think there's plenty of physical evidence and well-researched evidence in the world, like things that science still can't quite explain.
Yes.
Right?
Like,
Well,
yeah,
there's a
like
reason you can't
paranormal
explain
phenomena.
it. Right. So we're not, and maybe someday they will explain it, because I think that part of that entity's plan was to have us, become industrialized and develop this kind of technology that allows us to do things like observe the stars. I have to pause because I have to pee.
That's
So
okay.
I will be right back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
And I won't keep you too much longer. Um, so particularly just in keeping with the theme that we were talking about, particularly people who have practiced witchcraft or other esoteric practices, right? Because it's not like witchcraft is the only esoteric practice
Yeah.
out there. We have had and we have recorded tons of experiences like that. You know, like feeling a presence or hearing a voice in our heads that is clearly not our own. That happens to me frequently. And I think that, like they say all people are psychic or telekinetic, but it's something we were all born with, but we were so easily talked out of that being a superstition and not a thing that was real, that those powers
Yeah.
lie dormant within us, right? I mean, that's the kind of the theology of a lot of different schools of witchcraft, is that anyone can do this. You just have to allow yourself to be open to believing that you can do it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, not all schools of witchcraft think that, right? Some schools believe that you're born a witch and that a witch can't be made. You have to be born that way. I don't really know which is correct or incorrect. I don't really care. And I don't mean like I don't fucking care. I mean that like I don't think it makes a difference. Like it wouldn't change my belief
No. Yeah.
about the things I believe one way or another. I have oh, I can actually show you because we're in this room. So I have this, and of course the podcast audience is going to be like, well, we want to fucking see that. So yeah, but I'll post it to Instagram and TikTok. So I have this brick and mortar and or I'm sorry, mortar and pestle. And several years, not probably about 3 years ago, maybe four, I was doing a lot of, I had just discovered Hecate. That's what we call her here in the States. There's a lot of debate about, is it Hecate or Hecate or Hecate? From the research that I did, both Hecate and Hecate are correct, depending upon what region of the world you were in.
Yes, I would say Hecate, but that's just because I do Latin.
Right. So I was doing a lot of work with her because and this is the influence of social media in the United States. I'm sure it's very similar over there, right? Like, Hecate showed up in a very popular supernatural based television series. And then the next thing you knew, it's all anybody was talking about, particularly in the witch and pagan community. And everybody was talking to her, who was also one of those primordial goddesses, right? The one that
Yes, of
has
course.
been with us. So I was doing work with her, and I had and it was the first time I mean, I've always had experiences like this, but not quite so. Yeah, that was pretty undeniable, that thing that just happened. You know what I mean? Um, and I had two experiences. One was, so I buy those like 7-day vigil candles in glass, and I have an altar in my living room. And so I leave a candle burning on there. Not all the time, but most of the time. And I frequently leave it burning overnight, which I know more paranoid people would freak out about. But you know what? I'm pretty well protected, I think. Um, and I had been doing that for a long time, burning those candles. And one morning I got up. This was while I was doing this kind of work. I was doing a lot of shadow work, and I needed her because I needed to go to the cave and face my own darkness and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And so I came out and I realized that the glass had broken in the middle of the night. Here's the weird thing. When I went over to the bookshelf, because I expect to go over there and see wax like all down the front of the bookshelf, all over the floor. And the candle itself or the glass itself had broken. It wasn't a clean cut, it was jagged, but it was, I don't know, it was like it was only in two pieces, and the piece that broke off fell backward behind where it broke, like towards the back of the bookshelf, and the other was what was left holding the wax that was left in the bottom of the shelf. And I thought, now I had already been doing this kind of work for long enough to be like, so that might be Hecate just making herself known. Like, it's weird, but okay. And then later that, I don't remember if it was the same day, it might have been the following day, it might have been a few days later, I don't know. I was standing in my kitchen. And it's a small kitchen. It's just like an island kitchen with a, open concept living room, with a counter around
Yeah.
it. And I was standing in the kitchen, and I felt this like presence, like somebody walked by me. And I thought it was my wife. I thought she was standing behind me. And I like went to turn around and I didn't see her, and I went to turn around and didn't see her. And I thought she was playing a game with me, like little kids do when they walk up and tap somebody on the shoulder, and then you turn around and they hide behind your leg or whatever. And then I realized that my wife was standing at least 20 feet away by the front door.
Okay.
And I believe with every fiber of my being that was Hecate. And I wasn't scared. I mean, it was eerie, but I wasn't afraid. So that's what I mean when I say this kind of shit happens to me all the time. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say was, and I think this trips up in, very kind of intellectual, logic-based people, which I think a lot of academics are. And also a lot of non-academics are, right? I mean, it's part of our brain. We have a logical side of our brain.
Yes, of course.
So from that perspective, like, I know that whatever that is, whatever that non-physical entity is, it isn't male or female.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I know that. But goddess worship is about having, for me, goddess worship is about having something that works for me, because I am limited in my human capacity, and I need things that I can see, smell, hear, and touch, and primarily see. I need iconography.
Yes.
So all of my iconography is and plus I'm a lesbian, right? So all of my iconography are about with these beautiful redheaded, often, right, like Celtic goddesses, and goddesses like Venus, and so I just wanted to clarify that I think, that I do understand that whatever that being isn't male or female, or another way to look at that, or is both, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That because we do all have masculine and feminine, like, DNA, right? That's the difference between biological sex and gender.
Yes.
Right? Gender is a social construct, sex is a physiology based thing.
It's funny you say that, because the very, very earliest depictions of Aphrodite / Venus, she was depicted as an hermaphrodite.
Really?
Body
Okay.
in male and female.
And I've read that about some other, I can't recall which ones off the top of my head. But I've read that about some other goddesses as well. And I don't know what else I was going to say. I take a lot of medication that makes me really tired. So, like, the brain cells are starting to shut down. They're like, okay, we need to go take a nap. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to wrap up and I'm going to ask it. So at the end of the show, we ask all of our guests 3 questions.
Okay.
Are you ready for your 3 questions that you were not at all prepared for, because we don't tell people ahead of time?
Okay.
Okay. Question 1, and they're all fun questions.
Okay. Okay.
You may not find them fun, but I like to ask them. Tell us a fun fact about yourself, doesn't have to be a fun fact, just a fact, that people who know you well would be surprised to discover.
People that know me well. So it's something that people that know me well don't know.
Yes.
Um, okay.
Some
I know.
quirky thing.
A quirky thing. Okay. So
Yeah.
most people don't know this, obviously, other than my parents. But when I first started university, 7 years ago now, I originally went into the sciences, not history or classics. And I took a student placement with the National Trust. I'm not sure you'll know what that is in America, but basically they look after old houses and like nature spaces. And I went to work at a place called Clumber Park, which is a Victorian dukedom, but the house is gone and it's just all the gardens.
Mhm.
And some of the trees got bracket fungus, and they didn't want it to spread to the healthy trees. So they had to cut the tree down, and they thought, oh, this is a good initiation routine for our new recruit. Let's get Kendal to do it. And so, despite being as feminine and girly as I am, here I am, like lumberjack Jill, cutting a tree down.
That's fun.
It is fun.
I thought you were going to say, and I refused to do it because it's nature and I didn't want to cut down a tree. That's what I would have done.
Oh, this thought did cross my mind, but I didn't want the other trees to get ill.
Right, right. Right.
So,
You were actually doing some
yes,
conservation
yes.
and preservation. So, okay. Tell us your current favorite TV series or movie.
Oh,
You can only pick one.
I can only pick one. Well, last week I was sick in bed with COVID,
Oh,
and in a
sorry.
moment of delirium, I thought, oh, I'm going to put Disney Plus on and see what She-Hulk's all about. I am now addicted.
Really?
Really.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen it yet. So, all right. All right. And finally, and this is the question people usually find the most difficult, what one song would be the theme song of the soundtrack of your life up to and including this moment?
Um,
I mean, you're young, so it might be a little easier for you.
I am young, but I have got a 7-year-old, so um, I don't know. Do you know what makes this really difficult? I don't listen to that much music.
Well, then it should be easy.
Um,
Or songs like that you've heard on movie soundtracks or scores of music. It doesn't have to be, it
maybe
doesn't have
like
to be, it doesn't have to be a song that has lyrics.
maybe like if it has to be the soundtrack to my life, maybe it should be something like the Imperial March of like Darth Vader. Constant
Okay.
boom.
That's the best answer I've heard yet. All right. So, is there anything further you want to say or ask or add?
um,
Again,
oh,
sorry you
oh,
didn't get to talk about Venus as much as you
only
have
that I
wanted
didn't
to.
get to talk about everything that I wanted to talk about, so I'd love to come back and talk to you again.
Yes, absolutely. You can come back. I suspect that I will develop a kind of a rotation of people who are on the show more than once because so many of you are so knowledgeable about, about many different things. It was very hard to nail CG Dolan back down because he knows about everything, like everything. I swear he knows about everything. You should listen to that one if you haven't listened to that yet, episode 4. So, well, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Thank you very much.
will let you know when it's posted. Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll do it again.
Okay, I'd love
All
to.
right. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for listening. New episodes drop every Saturday, so keep tuning in. You can also find the Girlfriend God on social media, both on TikTok and Instagram, hashtag the Girlfriend God, hashtag the Girlfriend God podcast. Again, thanks for listening, liking, sharing, and following.